why is it? The fascinating thing is, to give you a rough estimate, I estimate that by any reasonable measure, the United States today is a little over 50% socialist. That is to say, something over 50% of the total resources in the country, the total input, is directly or indirectly controlled by governmental institutions at all levels, federal, state, and local. Yet we in the United States have the highest standard of living of any country in the world. We're a very rich and prosperous country. It's an extraordinary tribute to the productivity of the market system that with less than 50% of the resources, it can produce the kind of standard of living and the kind of society we have. If I asked anybody in this room, if I said to you people, you know, you're working from January to close to June 30th, or maybe somewhere over June 30th, to pay for the expenses of government. What fraction of your well-being comes from those governmental programs? Is it anything like 50%? I doubt very much that I would find many who said that's true. So the question that my puzzle raises is, why is it that private enterprises should be successful and government enterprises are not? One common answer is that the difference is in the incentive. That somehow the incentive of profit is stronger than the incentive of public service. In one sense that's right, but in another it's wrong. The people who run our private enterprises and the people who run our governmental enterprises have exactly the same incentive. In both cases, they want to promote their private interests. Any notion that our public, we call them civil servants. When you sit opposite an IRS person, do you think he's the servant and you're the master? The idea that, the people who go into our government, who operate our government, are just the same kind of people as are in the private sector. They're just as smart in general. They're have just as much integrity. They have just as many altruistic and selfish interests. There's no difference in that way, but the one thing all of them are going to do is to put their private interests first. As Armin Alshin, an economist at UCLA, once put it, the one thing you can depend on everybody else to do is to put his interest above yours. That's a very, very insightful comment. The Chinese who are on the mainland are not different than people from the Chinese who are in Hong Kong. Yet the mainland has been a morass of poverty, and Hong Kong has been an oasis of relative well-being. The people who occupied West Germany and East Germany before they were divided had the same background, the same culture. They were the same people. But the results were drastically different. So the problem is not in the kind of people who run our governmental institutions versus those who run our private institutions. The trouble, as a Marxist used to say, is in the system. And the system is what's at fault. The difference is the private interest of people in the private sphere is served in a different way. They do different things to serve their private interest. The private interest of people in the governmental sphere is served in a different way. You can illustrate that very simply by considering the bottom line they both face. Here's an idea of a project. It might be suggested to begin with by somebody in the private sphere or by somebody in the government sphere. It might be just as good in one as the other, just as promising. But, all good ideas are conjectures, and they're experiments. Most are going to fail. What happens? A private group gets together and starts an enterprise. Suppose it does badly. It starts to lose money. The only way you can keep it going is by digging into your own pocket. You have to bear the cost. That enterprise will not last long, people will shut it down. They'll go on to something else. Now consider a government enterprise. A government enterprise is started, and it doesn't work very well. What happens? They could shut it down, but they have a very different alternative. With the best of intentions, they can believe that the only reason it hasn't done well is because it isn't big enough. And they can finance an extension not out of their own pockets. Indeed, on the contrary, financing an extension will enable them to keep lucrative jobs. But they can finance their extension out of the pockets of the taxpayers if only they can persuade the taxpayer, the legislators, and the people who control the purse that their project is a good one. And they're able to do it. Because in turn, the people who vote on it aren't voting their own money. They're spending somebody else's money. And nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as he spends his own. So the end result is that when a private enterprise fails, it's closed down. When a government enterprise fails, it's expanded. Isn't that exactly what's been happening in the area of drugs? Isn't that what's been happening in the area of schooling? I mentioned that we were all aware of the deterioration in schooling. But are you aware that we are now spending per pupil, on the average, 3 times as much as we were 30 years ago, after adjustment for inflation? There's a general rule of government and bureaucratic enterprises. The more you put in, the less you get out. As these socialized enterprises have broadened their reach, it has become more and more difficult for the public to control. That's the fundamental problem we face in this drug area. How do we get the vested interests of the government to change their policy? It's not an easy job, as we have all discovered. They have a great deal more resources than we have. They are in a position to make it seem not respectable, not reasonable, that after all, these people who want to urge the legalization of the war on drugs are simply ignorant or naive or don't understand what's going on. But as the government has spread into wider and wider areas, it's become more and more difficult to control it, to change it, to get bad programs cut down. In all cases, the major source of getting bad programs out of the way is private competition. The post office used to be just as inefficient in delivering parcels as it is in delivering first-class mail. But because the postal statutes only covered the monopoly on first-class mail, UPS was able to take away their business. Private enterprise destroyed. Because Federal Express came in. We have case after case, and of course, facts developed and so on. So we have case after case where private competition has undermined government monopoly. That's exactly what goes on in the area, went on in the area of prohibition in the 20s, and what goes on in the area of drugs now. But unfortunately, the private competition which occurs here is not quite as harmless as UPS or the Federal Express. And that's not an effective solution in this area. In this area, we do have to get the law changed. But my main point is, can be expressed in 2 main points, and that's where I want to close and open it up to questions from you. First, do not fool yourself into thinking that solutions which involve the use of the political mechanism in a different way will in fact work.